And welcome to the Specialty Match podcast. My name is Ryan. This is my co-host Zongjun, who also goes by Sam,
Hello.
and we're the co-founders of Sanko Matcha Products.
Yeah, we launched this podcast to discuss our learning journey in matcha, share startup stories, and interview experts. And today we're going to try to our minds around what are there some white space or missing pieces that we can add to this very fast developing world of matcha that we are seeing today. In the past few years, we've seen like matcha literally just exploded all around the world in different countries. And most of them are honestly, in my opinion, I don't know if you agree with me, Ryan, but try to copy what specialty coffee has done in the past. And basically, a lot of these players are following a very similar playbook in turning matcha into a specialty product. But what can be done differently on
Yeah.
top of that?
Or what can be done differently in the sense of like what is happening now? Because I think that the coffee industry is a fantastic parallel because it feels like they're about like 2 decades ahead of what specialty matcha could be. And there's been a really interesting ecosystem develop. And if you listen to old timer specialty coffee people who have, a presence on the internet, you have like really famous influencers like Lance Hendrick and like James Hoffman, and then more niche people like Scott Rayo or Matt Perger. I shouldn't say more niche necessarily, but they don't have like these crazy YouTube followings. Like someone like James Hoffman is clearly tapped into something way larger than what any specialty coffee person could have thought possible, given his viewership. But then you can go deeper down the rabbit hole, and the further down you go down that hole, you find different ecosystems, different voices, different people, different levels of education. And you have different like players that have emerged. And there's now a set of conditions, or has been a set of conditions within specialty coffee that can lead to new business models, basically. It's not just that you're a cafe operator or that you are a roastery or that you are an equipment distributor. These of course still exist, but now you can have all these other business models, which we want to get into. And I think the first super interesting one are competitions. We talk about competitions, in coffee and but we very rarely talk about them through the lens of a business. Now, of course, there's competitions within matcha at the national level in Japan, but there are no international competitions in for brewing, for example. So the people who are actually interacting with the consumer and understanding what they like, something equivalent to like the World Barista Championship doesn't really exist for matcha or for tea in generally, which would be really interesting to see either adopted into the World Barista Championship or someone creating their own version.
Yeah, but I will foresee that a difficulty being like who has the authority to set the standards for such competition to exist. Like naturally, I think people would try to look into Channel U, but different schools of Channel U in the first place have different whisking methods, different
Hmm.
criteria for standards, and then you would naturally get into the weeds of like is it like reappropriating like a culture for like a contemporary thing, like who gets to set what and who gets to say what's better than what. Sounds very difficult and complex.
Very difficult and complex. One of the things that inspired the topic for this episode, I was listening to an old interview that James Hoffman did. I've been a fan of his since the very beginning of his YouTube journey. I think I found him in 2018 when I was really into specialty coffee. When he was back doing his travel vlog when he released his book.
Ah, I remember that. He actually went to China
Yeah,
at the time.
he went to Changsha, where your ancestry is from. It was
Pretty incredible.
pretty weird thing for someone to do. I don't know, 6 years ago.
Yeah,
Is
and at that time, like there must be like, I don't know, 10 specialty cafes in Shanghai.
let alone a tier two city most people have never heard of outside
Yeah,
of China.
it's super strange, but very cool.
Very cool. And he was talking about his experience. So, for those of you that don't know, James Hoffman was the world barista champion. Please forgive me. It's like 2007 or 2008, something like that. He was a world barista. He was a really early world barista championship winner. And he was doing some retrospection and giving some thoughts on how the competition has evolved and how it started. And actually, I have a really good quote from him. And it goes something like the World Barista Championship was designed to give legitimacy to what was a very niche movement at the time. And that specialty coffee was really actually in its infancy and it wasn't perfect and it's still not perfect.
Mm.
I mean, if you can watch they live I think they live stream it. If at the very least they record it. No, I think they live stream it because when I was a freshman in college, someone organized a viewing party for the World Barista Championship.
Oh, really?
Um,
Wow, it was like really I guess crossing the chasm like moment.
yeah, almost, yeah, of it being on the internet, and
Yeah,
we
yeah.
watched it, and it's a little absurd. Like, you're watching someone, and there's, like, 3 people with clipboards examining every move that the poor barista's doing. Like, if you drop a coffee ground, if you forgot to clean this thing up, if you weighed it properly, like, all the techniques are being judged. Um And it is a little absurd, but at the end, it actually has brought the specialty coffee movement a lot of legitimacy. A lot of tools have come out of that competition. A lot of trends have come out of that competition. The single most, what we would say probably now is the most important coffee grinder in the world, EK43. Reason it became popular was because Scott Rayo discovered it. It was originally a spice grinder, discovered that it had a really good particle size distribution for coffee, who was friends with a guy named Matt Perger at the time, who also is a former world barista champion and now runs the fantastic blog Barista Hustle. And I've had the pleasure of meeting him a couple times over the years at the Specialty Coffee Association back at my last job. And it was considered controversial at the time that you would use this type of grinder in these competitions to make an espresso, and he just blew the competition out of the water. And overnight, the EK43 became the new gold standard. It kind of erased a bunch of old assumptions about what was good, proved, oh no, like actually this thing, this new method of grinding with this new grinder actually can yield very high quality results and shifted the entire equipment industry within coffee.
Interesting. So the participants at the time, they can use their own equipment to grind the coffee beans that they
Yes.
bring into?
And they select the coffee, and now the coffee selection is really the crazy part too, where,
Interesting.
they will work very closely with different farmers who are also kind of innovating because you don't wanna do things that are last year. It creates an incentive cycle to do interesting things, whether or not it's remineralizing your water, whether or not it's another big innovation that came out of this is you can freeze a gigantic block of metal. Um, and you can put it underneath the portafilter. So when you're pulling an espresso, the hot espresso goes directly down onto this large cold metal block and it instantly drops the temperature. The
Instead of using
idea,
ice because it would dilute the coffee.
it will dilute the coffee, but also it spends less time hot. So there's supposedly more aromatic and volatile
Ah,
preservation. So you have less. So, like, that was a technique that was invented. So this would be really cool for our industry to have. And it probably will always kind of be a joke in the same way that the World Barista, I mean, the World Barista Championship winning it is no joke, but like it's still a little absurd. And a lot of people in the coffee industry like will say, yeah, it's imperfect.
but it's like kind of like the video that when you're talking about crossing the chasm, like people always reference to is like these two people dancing like
Yeah.
in a very chilled meadow, and people start watching these two people doing this ridiculous dance, and then it later just turns into a big party. Like this is something I think the specialty matcha community much needed.
And it would mint, I don't want to call them influencers, but like leaders, thought leaders. It mints thought leaders and it gives them a platform to then do something with it. James Hoffman ended up writing a book and starting and having his crazy YouTube career. Matt Pergard is now running Barista Hustle, which is the number one like barista education platform if you don't count the SCA, and making his own equipment. Like it platforms people in a way that gives them legitimacy and it has
Mm.
created this ecosystem. And it goes down to farmers, it goes down at the equipment level, it affects what drinks are being put on the menu. Right. I could totally see this working for matcha where people are promoting new cultivars, where people are doing new brewing methods. And biggest barrier one is probably Chanoyu because Chanoyu is the old and historic and quote unquote right and traditional and authentic way of preparing matcha, which leaves very little room to innovate forward. And to our tea friends who listen to the podcast, something that I always like to joke about is that there is no gongfu in Chanoyu. And to break that down a little bit, gongfu cha is Chinese tea ceremony, but gongfu translates as skill or the skillful way of making tea. And it's about just developing intuition through your senses, of understanding cause and effect relationships that create better or worse tea. So, using a Yixing teapot versus a porcelain gaiwan really can drastically change the taste of the tea. Or the water temperature obviously has a huge impact on the tea. How long you let it steep, what the dosage is. If you're using a compressed tea like pu'er, whether or not you pick it apart or leave it in a big clump drastically changes the amount of surface area exposed for flavor being extracted. And in Chaozhou, there's some like really advanced techniques. It's sort of the hometown of this idea of being a skillful brewer. They'll take these beautiful oolong leaves and crush it in their hands. And there's different like crushing ratios where they'll crush like 30%. They'll put it in the corner of the teapot and layer in the other leaves so that dust and that powder. But what they're really now controlling for is surface area for the amount that's being extracted all at once.
And at the same time, lit up a cigarette, smoke bigly.
And squatting on the ground, fanning the flames of their little charcoal stove.
Quite a scene.
Interesting scene.
Quite a scene.
So, Chinese tea practitioners spend an unusual amount of time practicing this gongfu, and this skill and experimenting is and it's talked about too. There's a pretty rich flavor vocabulary for expressing what you're experiencing through your senses. And for those of you that have studied Chanoyu, either Mota Senke, Ura Senke, and other school of Chanoyu, I am pretty sure I have never heard any discussion about how the brewing changes the taste of the tea, other than maybe don't use boiling water. And sometimes in Urasenke, you can be criticized, or excuse me, in Emotosenke, you can be criticized for whisking too heavily. But never once are you given an explanation.
Urasenke is that way, sir.
Dame,
Dame, dame, dame.
Urasenke, dame. But it's not the type of education where you're given the first principles or the foundations to understand how you can express flavor through preparation. And when we interviewed Jeb from MTCH a few months ago, hearing him talk about, whisking time and duration, and how that impacts like the extraction, and how some of the whisking times are into 90 seconds to extract what the least extractable parts. There's a lot of flavor that are then locked up in there, and they're totally optimizing around what they want to highlight in that brewing. It's not just a set recipe or a set ratio. So that is one really big structural barrier because everyone goes to Chanayu practitioners as the experts, but they know nothing about the cause and effect relationships in changing brewing parameters and the outcome. Really very close to nothing. Like maybe there's some hobbyists that have experimented with it on their own, but it is really a subject that falls outside of Chanayu.
Although we are seeing some recent, I would say, innovations within the Channel U schools, for example, the Yamato of Edo,
And
Edo Senke.
yeah, for
Uh,
fun, I guess.
but I think it's a sign, it's a statement that they are embracing, the contemporary culture.
That's true. We were talking with someone in Yame, the traditional old blend house there, and he was like, "Oh, I just saw an Instagram story of the Iamoto of Edo Senke making usacha with sparkling water." This was very nice to see.
Very, very nice. And I mean, like, I think moving forward, we shouldn't necessarily think or trying to exclude Chano Yu out of this conversation. Like, it would be actually very cool, I think, that we can somehow incorporate them into the party as well. And I think there are people with innovations or innovative mindset that exist in that realm. We
No,
just
no
need to
doubt,
talk to them.
no doubt. And the way, I mean, there's a lot of like thinking that has to be done about the way a competition like this would be structured. But ultimately, it would be a business. Like you'd have to have sponsors, there would have to be an event. You'd have to either have a prize large enough or people compensated enough to fly from all over the world to participate,
That structure already exists.
who are
Yeah.
baristas.
in the channel your world, right? Like the whole Yamamoto endorsement situation.
Indeed, but, having this be international outside the scope of China, you would be, quite a bit of work. But this
That's true.
type of business could exist in the future.
Mm.
It's a mixture of, I guess, ultimately advertising and events and a lot of organization. But we'd love to see some equivalent to that and something we wish existed.
Very true. Very true.
Another one that's not really a company necessarily, but definitely a career that I would like to see is the equivalent to what in coffee you would call as a green buyer. So, like green buyers in coffee, their job is to do quality control in the coffee, select the coffee lots, work with either importers or producers or distributors, depending on where they're buying the green or unroasted coffee from and bringing it in as things that will be used as blend components, things that are kept as single origin. And their job is to basically handle all of that operational complexity of buying, of contracting, of making sure it's financed, of making sure that the sample that you were sent is the same as like these 50 sacks of coffee that just arrived. Is that the same? And it's quite a bit of work. It's a very important job.
Sounds much like, chashi nowadays.
Pretty close. Yeah.
Actually, it is what it is. But what we have not been seeing is such a person exists outside of Japan in the
Yeah.
international level, which is, it's for chashi, they're basically, tea blenders in Japan that usually is the head of a tea company in different region, or at least holds a very important role in the tea company because they need to make decisions for buying wood in the auction, by also purchasing how much or sell, like how much quantity and also how much money they should be bidding, which we have heard some uh, what used to be very successful chashi are not having much luck in recent days in the auction because their mental model of price has been a little bit outdated because of this whole explosion in matcha. But yeah, Chashi really holds a lot of these functions in the world of matcha. But I don't think there's a single non-Japanese Chashi.
I
We've heard that there's one guy who's trying to become the first non-Japanese Chashi.
Yeah, David from Tazumi
Uh,
mentioned he had a friend who was an American that was interested in doing it.
yeah, but
But that's the only circumstance I have heard of. It is you need the skill set of a Chashi, but having this like these different matcha companies in the same way that roasteries do, like I know if we reach a certain size, we absolutely need a green buyer. Like if we reach where we're moving in the metric tons of matcha and we need to make a bunch of interesting decisions, like that is a full-time job.
yeah, yeah. But one other obstacle is that all of these auctions in Japan are Japanese participants only, almost.
Yep.
So it's actually touching a very systematic and fundamental inertia, or how do you call that?
Structural barrier.
Structural barrier of the current, system that exists largely just in Japan right now. Although, I would envision like such precision being much easier to achieve in places like China.
Oh yeah.
There's not such thing as regional auctions and Chinese only auctions here.
The Chinese market's much more practical, thankfully. But it's interesting the way that this works, and I think the reason that a green buyer hasn't existed up until this point. One, you can eventually meet a chashi and ask for some level of customization and quality guarantees. And a lot of these chashis have relationship with other ones, and there's some degree of inter-chashi, inter-company trading for sure going on outside of the auction system. So there's some movement of product domestically within Japan, but there's very little visibility into where it came from, how much it was originally. You have no idea what people's markup are. So it's really very gated. And actually, for an agricultural standpoint, for a country's economy, it's really good that it's a seller's market. Because if you look at the opposite, the idea of having like Q graders and green buyers in coffee, and they have the equivalent in chocolate. My girlfriend started her career in chocolate and quality control and chocolate fermentation and doing sensory analysis. So I'm a bit familiar with that world as well, is that you're primarily working with the world's poorest countries. It is a buyer's market when you're working in coffee for the most part. I mean, unless you're trying to source something like Le Esmeralda Panama Geisha or something that just has like insane demand, or like Finca Deborah, or like all of these really, really, really famous names, right? Like you're working in poor countries where the average income is extremely low, and which comes with its own complexities too, of making sure it's being processed in an approved facility and that has the right testing and the right papers for export. It's very much post-colonial structures that just don't exist the same way in Japanese tea, right? The reality of Japanese tea is that almost everyone in the industry is properly educated, they all have smartphones, and they drive nice cars. Like it's very first world agriculture. And that's a great thing when you compare it to these other industry. A artifact of that, a secondhand effect of that is that like it hasn't yielded the necessity of a green buyer yet. I'm hoping as matcha becomes more international in places like Korea, China, Vietnam, northern Thailand, that the role of a green buyer slash chashi type person who's doing purchasing for people who are doing their own blending, milling, or later stage refining and processing of tencha into matcha can have access to those systems. But I think that's part of the reason why this just doesn't exist yet, because it hasn't needed to.
Yep, very true.
But as we move into the future, getting closer to the product and to the production and to the agriculture will necessitate the need of someone who is taking care of all of them. So I hope the Japanese tea ecosystem can open up a little bit, because ultimately, I mean, Japan is still a very male dominated country, especially in an industry like tea. And as I've said many times on this podcast, the majority of flavor and quality decisions and price decisions are being made by old Japanese men. Not exclusively, but most of the control and the volume is heavily controlled by old men. Old Japanese men who don't know what the preferences are of people in all of the corners of the world. And it's much better off if a little more power is given to people that are closer to the consumer. And a great example of this is that we've heard a lot of stories too uh, of farmers that are locked into wholesale relationships. They can't even go to auction. This is true for a lot of Uji matcha farmers, actually, where they have these ancient relationships where they have to commit way north of 50% of their volume to these large blend houses that we all know. And it turns out that last year, some hand-picked Tizumi tea from Uji, like Uji itself, was selling for less than Wazuka machine cut tea. So, like, that is a crazy statement. And then you ask why. Well, it's the equivalent of not being paid because you're working for your grandfather whose mind is still in 1990s, thinking that $5 an hour is an appropriate wage to be doing whatever it is that you were hired to do, right? The price that like those wholesale companies give those Uji farmers is way lower than market price. In the same way that you're working for your clueless uncle or your clueless grandfather that believe that like $5 an hour is an appropriate wage when it's not.
Well, in reality, I think they're just very trapped by this contract system.
Well, there's no contracts. That makes it even more fuzzy. It seems like this whole system, at least from the people we've talked to, lives in a whole lot of ambiguity. You have to sell and give that volume to the wholesaler, otherwise, they will never buy from you again. And that is your biggest customer and has been your biggest customer for maybe 200 years. Like, that's a scary relationship to exit.
Yeah, like they basically people exchanged security over, capital gain for the short term. And for them, that there actually lies two difficulties, right? Like one, there's no clear alternative. Well, ultimately, they are being trapped by this, legacy purchasing history with all these plant houses, which has worked historically, right? Like back in the days when matcha was not such a popular thing, like all of these farmers can only survive because they're were stable buyers coming from these large blend houses. And for them that, it's quite a scary thing to cut off these legacy relationship with the blend houses because then they will be on their own, voluntarily or involuntarily. It's interesting. Actually, I see a lot of parallel between this situation with some other tea production regions too, which shares kind of a similar dynamic. So I was just in Laos, northern Laos, which is bordering Chinese Yunnan province, which is a very large tea production region nowadays, and it's considered the origin of tea, actually, by many. But historically, Laotian tea farmers are living in such a comfortable stage because buyers will just come into Laos from China to procure whatever tea they can get their hands to, and then they would funnel it back to Yunnan and gets processed as Chinese pu'er.
Post CNNP though, right? Like
Yeah, yeah,
last like
yeah, yeah, yeah,
3, 4 decades.
yeah, yeah, 3, 4 decks post ENNP, but they will get processed. Actually, that part is a little vague too, because at the time the border was not fixed,
Oh,
and there were buyers going, between these villages all the time. Actually, the border was only being so fixed and closed after COVID. And
uh-huh.
before then, like a lot of these people can just travel freely between the two countries in the mountain.
CNNP cakes could have
Could have Laotian tea. It's very possible. But yeah, so like people really enjoyed this kind of dynamic for a long time, and so was tea farmers in Yunnan, in all of these like famous tea regions, and they have like procurement relationship with all these big brands and big tea manufacturers as well. But recently, the economy has not been so good in China, so the domestic consumption of pu'er has decreased drastically, and a lot of these tea farmers have lost their own capability to sell their own tea, which they can now only relying on the procurement from these large brands. A lot of these Yunnan farmers are surviving at the moment because these larger brands are still buying tea from them.
mm,
But these
security
Laotian
goes
tea
both
farm
they got shafted.
they got shafted. These Laotian farmers are in big trouble. They got totally cut off from the system, the over demand system before.
Yeah.
So there is wisdom for Uji farmers to stay in this current system because it is a security in a difficult time.
And there's an even more interesting parallel. Part of the reason that the pu'er cycle had boomed so much in the past 15 years is there's something called the pu'er bubble in 2007, 2008.
Mm.
What happened was a bunch of Chinese people became convinced that pu'er was a good investment. Pu'er is a type of tea that can age. So there was so much material produced that has never been consumed. People were buying it. There were all these stories of people buying these cakes, aging them, and then it became an investment. So a ton was produced and given away as gifts. A ton was produced to sit around and age. A lot of uneducated buyers entered the market, a lot of quote unquote stupid money, creating this insane demand, which turned into a bubble, and which then kind of popped. And now domestic consumption is still falling for this type of tea within China. So in those circumstances, like this really good forest, ancient tree tea from Laos, like was going to that top of the market, but now it's all fallen out.
Yeah, and there's even more similarities to the current Uji situation because the Laotian tea at the time was so conveniently borrowing the fame of Pu'er and Yunnan tea and all of those sub-regions that's bordering those villages in Laos that they're just conveniently called themselves the Chinese equivalent of that. But now, after them being cut off, they can no longer use those names,
Mm.
but their own credibility hasn't been set up, even though like it is pretty similar in quality, right? It's very similar to what's going on between Wazuka and Wuji right now.
Yeah, that's an interesting parallel. Imagine Wazuka didn't have a famous name and they had these very temporary wholesale relationships that vanished overnight.
Or all of these sub-regions nearby Uji. Imagine like Uji really gets like a GI certificate in the future and becomes
Yeah.
like has to be Uji. Like what are all these other regions gonna do? Like no one has heard of Mie like in the middle of somewhere Pennsylvania, probably. but like they have maybe at the time heard of Wuji, but they cannot use the name Wuji anymore. So that it will be a big trouble for these regions.
Something
Uh,
that Sam just alluded to, Mie is a different prefecture, but under the Uji matcha trademark in Japan, you can use 100% Mie grown leaves so long as they're processed in Kyoto,
mm,
not Uji. In Kyoto prefecture, anywhere in the prefecture, you can call it Uji. I mean, you have roughly 1,500 tons of tea that are riding on the name Uji, or that theoretically can ride on the name Uji.
yeah.
So if it does get GI, yeah, what are all of these other places going to do? Like we were in northern Kyoto last year in Fukuchiyama. Who's ever heard of Fukuchiyama as a tea origin? Even people in Japan were like, why did you go there? Like it produces like decent tea, but it's not like, special cultivars. They're using synthetic fertilizer. Like they're producing fantastic quote unquote ceremonial grade tea that would probably work great in a cafe, right? Like it's high quality tea from that perspective, but it's actually pretty mediocre tea if you're putting it next to a Hanzu Asahi from Shirakawa. So you have a lot of not only from this region, but from a lot of other places that are making tea in a similar methods, much more industrial agriculture, not interesting cultivars, synthetic fertilizer. And you have a bunch of mediocre matcha riding the Uji matcha name. And if they get GI status, this is why Uji will never have a GI status.
Mm,
I mean, there's 4,000 metric tons of matcha produced in Japan approximately right now. And what is that? That's over one third can legally ride the name Uji, which is a crazy statement considering Uji is a tiny, 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 tiny town. It's hard to describe how tiny Uji is. There are 35 active farming families in Uji, and having about a third of your country's production being able to ride that name, it would be an economic crisis as what's happening. Actually, the Laotian example is pretty interesting.
yeah. And also like all of these other regions, I mean, like they're basically a extension of the Uji system or a extension of a Uji style tea. Like they're basically commodity supplier for a style of tea that gets made in a very specific region in Japan. Whereas all these other places have their own terroir, have their own climate, have their own distinctive tea growing environment and cultivation environment, and probably accessibility to different sets of machineries or fertilizers. The potential diversity of the flavor space of matcha can be huge. But now all of these places are riding the boat of Uji and just becoming and very comfortably becoming a supplier of Uji tea, which is a very, very unique, you know, tea making culture and a specific style of making tea that has been developed historically in this very little town outside of Kyoto.
Actually, bringing this back full circle, because I was wondering how we were going to do this, back to our desire to have a green buyer, a tencha buyer, what we're going to call green buyer in matcha, is that it can help make the other regions famous. There's a whole new market that literally has appeared overnight in the last, like, say, 5 to 10 years. It's interested in single origin products, all being like we have a third, over a third of the matcha produced in Japan can be called uji matcha. It's not single origin. It is, if you're calling it single origin, it is a lie. There's no objective treatment. You can call it uji style. That would be a correct statement, but it is not single origin. It does not come from Uji and was not grown there. Which is what everyone understands when you call it something like that, is that these buyers can go, this system is locked. If you want to find Joyo tea, if you want to find Wazuka tea or Uji Tawara and Wazuka are becoming, it's a little bit easier to find farmers that work directly. But in a lot of these other regions that people have never heard of, um, or less heard of, like Ide. Ide is a little more obscure. Like I am currently not aware of anyone selling single origin Ide matcha. Right? That could have a huge market. Like these green buyers, these tencha buyers coming in, if they can get into the system, they can start pulling some of this volume out. and making a name for these other places who could really benefit and help build the future that we would like to see because you literally just can't get your hands on the material because it's
Yeah.
all controlled in this wholesale relationship system, this auction system, this chashi system, which has its merits, as we've stated, but it also is holding back what could be a very interesting future.
Indeed, indeed.
Wow, that was an interesting tangent. This was
Yeah.
deeper than I thought we would go, considering we only got into two professions.
Wow, it's a complicated situation we're trying to unwrap. And we are touching a lot of, I mean, like we have seen tea being made and being sold in a lot of different regions so differently. It's actually very interesting, like how the attitude of people treating tea as a tea plant, cultivating them and turning them into a finished product by the end of the day. And how do they frame this tea um, as part of either lifestyle, either just a business, or either a very intertwined component of a very sophisticated culture. It's just so interesting, like the attitude and the perception of tea across different culture. And I think a lot of these people doing things so differently can really benefit from learning from each other. Um,
Well, when we were at Basa Nakamura, it was really interesting talking to them because they're so aware. He's processed tea in Taiwan, making Taiwanese high mountain oolong with the producer there,
yeah.
Kundan, and the Thai matcha connections that he has in Chiang Rai. It's such a more rich experience when you can, leverage what's going on in other parts of the tea world.
And just have an open mind about what's being done in other places. It has honestly been very my perception and my attitude towards a lot of these practices has changed so much in the past few years. It used to be was like we have different teachers or experts in different regions of different countries. Ryan, you and I have been to a few of these trips back in the Tea Institute era, and also as a hobbyist later, I've been following different tea makers, tea farmers, or even professional tea drinkers into different areas in the world. And everyone talks about their own way of making tea, or quote unquote, the correct way of making tea. But after hearing so many stories, you just realize that there isn't really a correct way of making tea. Tea is such a versatile thing that is so adaptive to all kinds of usage scenarios. And by the end of the day, it's just a different flavor. There's no right or wrong flavor. It's just a different flavor, whether or not you like it. And it's so interesting. Like I always had this, very negative view towards a lot of tea farming practices in Japan in the very early days. The treatment of tea bushes, the usage of fertilizer and pesticides, and all of these things. But like by the end of the day, it's part of the recipe of making a version of tea, a flavor profile of tea. And if you look into how tea is being made in China, and there are so many different style too, and people are like trying to call each other out, but these are all a different version of making tea. And even when you're talking about like Chinese matcha, like I cannot forget that our friend in Bison Nakamura brought out this matcha, and his eyes were lit up, and he just had this big smile on his face and like try this Chinese matcha. It's delicious. Like that was my first time hearing a Japanese tea person telling me that sentence. And
Very rare.
very rare, and it was actually it was good. It tastes like white chocolate and with some very interesting roasted notes. It's a very distinct flavor profile and was not bad. It was actually pretty good. And just the fact that people have such an open-minded perception towards tea and towards how tea gets made, I think it's just super important and super um, fascinating and super fun. The least thing I want to do by the end of the day is drinking a weird tasting cup of tea and hearing like this uncle or grandpa just like ranting at other people's tea and complimenting himself of making the best tea in the region. Anyways, That's my reflection.
You see that everywhere, but it does feel a little concentrated in Japan with some of these people with some very armchair ideas about what's right and wrong.
And in China too, it's honestly the same thing. Speaking different languages, but they're the same people.
All right. So that's one and two. So preparation competition, something equivalent to the World Barista Championship and green buyer. Another one that I had is something we need a Mr. Coffee Pot. The Mr. Coffee Pot, it was such a powerful tool for households in the US, but households all over the world for people who need a very simple way to prepare something without thinking about it, that's semi automated, that's cheap, and gives you a decent result.
What is Mr. Coffee Pot?
It is like the world's cheapest drip brewer. Imagine like a hotel coffee maker. There's a reservoir for water. There's a little pump, a heating element. It drips it over the a cone of coffee, and out comes the coffee. It's
Interesting. Actually, I saw some company trying to do that in China last year, and they're trying to seal matcha into kind of like an espresso
oh,
capsule.
that's right.
But what I have heard, I actually haven't personally tried, but I've heard that the product is very bad. They
Okay,
taste very bad. And I think that's one
maybe they just need better matcha.
I think that's one obstacle for, matcha and we compare it to coffee is that like bad matcha really tastes bad.
Yeah, that's the
Like
gift that coffee has. Is
coffee is like it's still like acceptable most of the time.
like the taste of quote bad coffee. Like I have no problem drinking like instant coffee, Nescafe, or even just some like really old, like pre-ground, over roasted stuff. Like in the right context, like it still has some pleasant aroma. Like you can find the flaws if you want to, real, but like bad coffee still tastes pretty good.
Yeah,
Like it still tastes like coffee.
and smells like coffee.
But like random can of bad matcha that's old and brown, it's just
It's like
horrid.
dead fish
It's
or
not
like burnt plastic, some horrible smell.
it's very unpleasant, but I know, I think, and you could substitute the words Mr. Coffee Pot for Nespresso or for Keurig, any like very easy way. And you could argue that the Kuzen, might be the closest thing. And there's some companies now that are making matcha Nespresso pods. I mean, there is such a thing as instant matcha. I've never had anything that was prepared at the moment that really tasted very good. And the Kuzen's probably the top of that list. That's the combination of convenience and deliciousness. But it'd be really cool if, I mean, even the frother stick, I guess, is the closest thing that the industry has to like kind of make it a little easier on someone.
Mm,
But I think there's a lot of room in the matcha equipment space where someone can develop something where it's push button, put in my own matcha and make it taste good. Or put in my own tencha and there's some milling and mixing going on and make it taste good at the end of the day. I think it's very sad that like this all has to just be so complicated for like people to brew every day. And it's great if it's your morning ritual, but there are so many people who it's just not, it doesn't fit in within the context of their life. They
mm,
don't want to think about it. If you think about the number of people who buy Nespresso machines or that buy even like this, like the new Fellow equipment that's like ultra automated, it just produces something good and it's like one less thing to think about every morning.
right.
And there's a huge market of people that want their matcha moment every morning. But there's an even larger group of people that don't want that.
Mm,
And it's context specific. I hate doing it 80% of the time. I don't want my matcha moment. And that must be crazy for probably some people to hear, considering the profession that we are in. I don't enjoy making matcha 80% of the time. I don't. It's a pain. It's a pain if you don't have access to a temperature controlled kettle. It's a pain to hydrate the chasen. It's a pain to clean everything afterwards. Like it's great in the right mind, in the right context. It's not great every day. And one of the reasons why we made our first product, the Obsidian one dimensional matcha whisking bowl, is to kind of just take one less thing off. someone's plate who's making it, and where you don't have to have the perfect zigzag technique and anti-splash feature. And at the time, it was less common to see a bowl with a spout. Believe it or not, actually, when we first made that product, I kind of saw that as I mean, they existed, but something that was heavily advertised as form and function for matcha whisking. It felt a little bit more of a novelty than it is now.
Yeah, indeed.
But I think the ecosystem for this equipment is really could be really cool.
Yep. And we are solving them one by one.
Another company that I think would do so well, and this is really more of a passion project, is an aged matcha or an aged tencha library of someone. There have been a couple initiatives in coffee. If you go to any of the high end coffee places in like Paris, for example, like Substance or Motors Coffee, they have entire sections in the menu where they sell $20 to $25 a cup coffees. And they're all pre portioned and ziplocked or like vacuum sealed in a tiny bag in very cold freezer. And it kind of just preserves it there. And it's prepared to order. And you're able to have this huge library of different coffees, different harvests that have become relatively stable because they're kept at such low temperatures. And we've heard that like 5 year old or 10-year-old tencha, when kept at low temperatures, actually has some pretty like it preserves it pretty well. And
Mm,
we learned from Ian from Me, who's an early guest on the podcast, that you have that amino acids degrade slower than catechins. So you actually get a catechin and amino acid rebalance. And catechins are bitter and astringent, and those will lower very slowly over time. And the amino acids, which are sweet and savory and umami, stay preserved. So you get a rebalancing effect with the aging of this tencha. It'd just be like this is my like vision for like the top of the mountain, the pinnacle matcha experience would be someone that has the ability to milk fresh small quantities of tencha that are kept in storage, and you just build up this reference library to have the same thing as like a deep wine cellar. Like when wine lovers go to a three Michelin star restaurant, you expect depth and breadth in a cellar of different things. And having that same thing be about, it doesn't even need to be particularly expensive. I mean, the most expensive tencha that you can buy if you're buying wholesale, the competition grade stuff is maybe $4,000 or $5,000 a kilo, right? And that's a kilo. And when you're like calculating that per serving, actually, that's easy enough to do right now. At least the wholesale rates. If you're buying something $5,000
that's
kilo,
$5 a
$10,
gram.
$5,
$10.
it's $10. Like
$10 for a serving.
for like the best matcha in the world. That is crazy. Per serving, matcha is like orders of magnitude cheaper per serving than some of the finest wine in the world, for example. That's criminal almost that it can be that cheap. And any consumers listening, you can now backtrack your the margin that people put on competition grade tea when they sell it, and some of it is higher than 5,000 kilos, $5,000 per kilo. But
Well, the good news is you can indeed age tencha.
and
Take
having
notes, Yunnan Laoban. You can age tencha. Oh no.
yeah, so that is a business that I would love to see at the high end of the matcha market. And who knows? Maybe we'll start doing this as well when we have more money to invest after we sell a lot of these mills. It's something that we would personally like to see.
Let's go buy some fridges.
Freezers, deep freezers.
Freezers.
Yeah, we
Freezers.
need the
Yeah.
freezers. Yeah. All right, Sam, wanna do one last one and we'll wrap it up?
Well, the last one would be companies that look and feel like equivalents of Onyx or Say Coffee or Small Batch or all of these like coffee roasters or even like kind of like a coffee cultural center like counterculture that's doing a lot of value add than just not just making coffee or serving coffee. Like there are a lot of these value add that all of these players that are adding into the sphere of coffee culture, and we really want to see that to happen for matcha as well.
Yeah, and we're starting to see that now. A lot of
Yeah, bit by
companies
bit.
you could argue that, and I'm hesitant to give examples because I feel like I'm going to leave people out. But like two very famous in the examples in the US might be someone like a Kettle or an Oika, where they're milling fresh, they're highlighting farmers, they're doing educational workshops, right? Like it becomes this like sort of center of gravity in a commercial setting. And the commercial setting is so important because that's how it becomes sustainable and how getting commercial access to things. Like it's great. We can talk about Narino all day and what an incredible cultivar it is, but until you taste it, it's just
Yeah,
something you've heard about.
it's just words.
Like, if you have a place to do it and people to teach you who know how to prepare it and have the stuff and have the theory and
Yeah.
can sell you the stuff, like
Then it becomes an experience.
yeah.
And this is really, I would say, the best way to grow the pie larger because, that's something that people can very passionately talk about to their friends or to their family members or to their kids or to their parents. And this will really become big instead of, just a few reels, videos, or some words on a book or article telling you how amazing a tea is or how amazing a cultivar is.
And one of the things that we're so grateful for is that all of our beta program members who've pre-bought one of our mills have that community. They are these type of matcha companies, the equivalent of an Onyx coffee or a Say coffee or small batch from Australia. They're all local and so tapped in to the communities and what's going on and doing education and sourcing interesting things. And we're just so honored to be a part of what they're doing by us, like bringing in the mill. And we're so excited to learn from everyone when we travel to all of those places to do, or to half of those places, to do these implementations in the US and in other countries in Asia and in Europe, part of the implementation list. And we're so excited to see how that is getting expressed in this new culture that is being formed in these places. So, companies that look and feel like these famous coffee company equivalents, we're in the really early innings of it. And it's just blossoming into exactly what the name of this podcast is. It's blossoming into this specialty matcha movement, which is, I think, a perfect place to end.
Yes, indeed.
So thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed it, please consider sharing it with a friend and let us know which matcha companies you would like to see exist in the world. We'd love to know. So feel free to drop a comment or give us a DM, and very curious to hear like how you would like to see the future of matcha be written.
Awesome. See
Thank
you in
you.
the future.
Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye bye.